In 28 years on the bench, I presided over 204 investment fraud cases. The plaintiffs were retirees. The defendants were fund managers. The defendants were convicted in nearly every case. Not one plaintiff recovered more than 4 cents on the dollar. My name is James Harlow. I sat for 28 years as a trial court judge in the United States, presiding over civil matters involving estates, fiduciary disputes, and financial fraud against elderly Americans. I retired 4 years ago. I am speaking publicly now because nothing I did from the bench, in any of those 204 cases, returned a meaningful sum to a single victim. The work I did was the work of recording losses that had already occurred. It was not the work of preventing them. The only work that prevents these losses is information delivered before the fund manager makes the first call to the first recruiter. That is what I am attempting to provide. I want to be specific about the number 204. I am not estimating. I counted them at the end of my career, going back through the docket because by then I had stopped being able to remember the names. The pattern had become so consistent that the cases blurred into each other in my memory. I went back to count them because I wanted to know if my impression matched the record. It did. The first case I heard in this category, in 1996, involved a real estate investment fund, 43 plaintiffs, combined loss of $2.8 million, recovery rate, after final sentencing and asset forfeiture, of 3.1 cents per dollar lost. The last case I heard in this category, in 2022, involved a cryptocurrency fund, 170 plaintiffs, combined loss of $19.4 million. Recovery rate, after final sentencing and asset forfeiture, of 2.7 cents per dollar lost. 26 years apart, different products, different fund managers, different jurisdictions for the offshore accounts, identical outcome. I want to walk you through what happens between the moment the fund collapses and the moment the court can no longer help. I am not going to walk you through how the schemes operate. There is plenty of public material about how Ponzi schemes operate. I am going to walk you through the part nobody discusses, which is what the legal system actually does once the harm is done. When a Ponzi scheme collapses, the first sign is usually that distributions stop arriving. Investors start calling. The fund manager initially provides explanations, banking issues, regulatory delays, paperwork. The investors, who have been receiving their distributions on time for between 18 months and 4 years, are inclined to wait. Most of them wait between 3 and 10 weeks before calling a lawyer. The first lawyer they call is usually a generalist. The generalist looks at the documents, becomes concerned, and refers the client to an investment fraud specialist. The specialist obtains the file, reviews the offering documents, and contacts the regulators. The regulators usually already know. By the time the specialist begins gathering evidence, the fund manager has typically been aware for several weeks that exposure is coming. He has begun moving assets. He may already have left the country. A civil case is filed. A criminal case follows, often weeks or months later. The civil case proceeds against the fund manager and against any related entities the lawyer can identify. Asset tracing begins. Asset tracing is, in my experience, the most consistently disappointing aspect of these cases. The money invested in the fund did not stay in the fund's accounts. It was paid out as distributions to earlier investors. Those distributions were real. The investors who received them spent them. The money is no longer recoverable from those investors because they received it lawfully under the terms of the contract they signed and have no legal liability to return it. What remains is whatever the fund manager retained as compensation. That is typically between 15% and 30% of total inflows, although in some cases it is significantly less because the fund manager has been operating at a loss to maintain the appearance of profitability. The fund manager's retained earnings have generally been moved through a series of accounts, many of them in jurisdictions where my court had no authority to compel disclosure. The Cayman Islands, Panama, Cyprus, the Bahamas, the United Arab Emirates, increasingly Singapore. The funds, once located in those jurisdictions, are subject to local laws which often protect them from foreign judgments. Recovery, in legal terms, is the process of locating these funds, obtaining a foreign judgment that the local jurisdiction will recognize, and then enforcing that judgment against accounts that may have been further moved by the time enforcement is attempted. The process takes between 3 and 7 years in most cases. The legal fees consume a substantial portion of whatever is recovered. The plaintiffs are typically charged between 30 and 40% of any settlement under contingency arrangements with the recovery firms. The number that arrives at the bank account of the original victim, after all of this is concluded, is typically between 2 and 4 cents on the dollar of original loss. I am not aware of a single case I tried in which that figure exceeded 8 cents. The plaintiffs in my cases lost, on average, 97 cents of every dollar they had invested, and the legal process that followed returned to them, on average, 3 cents of that. The remaining 94 cents was permanently gone. I want to put this in concrete terms. A retiree who invested $200,000 in a Ponzi scheme that collapsed will, after a 6-year recovery process, receive a check for approximately $6,000. That retiree may have spent $15,000 in legal fees over those 6 years to obtain that check. The net recovery, in the typical case, is negative. If you are a recently retired American who has placed your retirement savings into any private investment that you cannot independently verify with a regulator, I am asking you to subscribe to this channel and leave a comment. The pattern I am describing is happening today, in dozens of ongoing schemes that have not yet collapsed. Comments surface this video to the next person who needs to see it before the collapse occurs. That is the difference between someone who recovers 90% of their retirement by withdrawing in time and someone who recovers 3 cents on the dollar after the legal process is complete. I want to describe one specific element of these cases that does not appear in the news coverage. It is the moment when the trial concludes, the jury delivers its verdict, the judgment is entered, and the plaintiffs begin to understand what the judgment will and will not do. In a normal civil case, a plaintiff who wins a judgment leaves the courthouse with the expectation that the defendant will satisfy the judgment within some reasonable period. The plaintiff and the defendant typically continue to exist in the same legal jurisdiction. The defendant has assets that the court can attach. The judgment will be paid, however slowly, however reluctantly. In Ponzi scheme cases, the judgment is entered against a defendant who has been preparing for this moment for months or years. The defendant has moved his liquid assets out of the country. He has structured his remaining domestic assets in ways that protect them from civil judgment, often through transfers to family members that occurred before the scheme collapsed. He has retained counsel familiar with the international architecture of asset concealment. By the time the judgment is entered against him, the architecture is already in place. The plaintiffs do not understand this at the moment of verdict. The plaintiffs leave the courtroom believing that they have won. They have not won. They have established on a piece of paper the legal fact of what was taken from them. The piece of paper has no money attached to it, and the legal mechanisms for attaching money to that piece of paper in the international jurisdictions where the money has been moved will fail in approximately 97 cases out of 100. I had to deliver this information to plaintiffs in chambers many times over my career. I generally arrange for the plaintiff's counsel to deliver it instead, but in the larger cases the plaintiffs would request meetings with me, and I felt obligated to honor those requests. The conversations were among the most difficult I had as a judge. The plaintiffs had spent years preparing for the verdict. They had organized their materials. They had testified. They had prevailed. They expected the system to follow through. The system was not capable of following through. There was no person to be angry at except, ultimately, the defendant, who was already on his way to a federal prison where he would serve a sentence that would not return any of their money. Let me describe what the courtroom looked like in those 204 cases. The plaintiffs sat in the gallery, often 100 or more in the larger cases. They were dressed neatly. They were quiet. They were old. The average age of the plaintiff in the cases I tried was approximately 72. The oldest plaintiff I recall reading testimony from was 91. They had brought folders containing their statements, their distribution receipts, their canceled checks, their correspondence with the fund manager. The folders were full. The plaintiffs had organized their materials with the care of people who had been keeping financial records all their lives. The folders were of no further use to anyone, but the plaintiffs did not yet know that. The fund manager typically sat at the defense table, flanked by counsel. The defendant, in nearly all cases, presented as a respectable, middle-aged man in a good suit. The defendants did not look like criminals. The defendants looked, with very few exceptions, like investment professionals, because for the duration of the scheme, they had been performing the role of investment professionals at a high level of competence. What they were doing was not investment, it was performance. The performance had ended, and now the performer was on trial. In the cases I tried, the defendants were convicted at a rate above 95%. The convictions resulted in prison sentences ranging from 6 years to 24 years. The criminal sentences were, in most cases, substantial. They did not return any of the money to the victims. Civil judgments, in nearly all cases, were entered against the defendants in amounts equal to the total losses claimed. The civil judgments were also substantial. They were also, in nearly all cases, uncollectible, because the defendants no longer had assets in jurisdictions where the judgments could be enforced. The plaintiffs walked out of my courtroom holding pieces of paper indicating that the defendant owed them, in some cases, several $100,000 apiece. Those pieces of paper had no value beyond their legal symbolism. I want to describe what I learned about the petition format. The petitions in these cases are filed by plaintiffs' counsel, but they include statements from the plaintiffs themselves. Those statements describe how the plaintiff first encountered the investment, what they were told, what documents they signed, when they first noticed something was wrong, and what they have lost. By the time I had read approximately 70 of these petitions, I noticed that the personal statements were nearly indistinguishable from each other across cases. The plaintiffs wrote in their own words, and yet the words came out almost identical. They described being introduced through a trusted person. They described receiving distributions reliably for an initial period. They described investing additional amounts as their confidence grew. They described the moment distributions stopped arriving. They described their initial willingness to accept the explanations the fund manager provided. They described the moment they understood the fund was gone. I should describe the specific year I noticed this because the realization shaped the rest of my career. It was 2009. I was reading the petition in the matter of a real estate fund that had collapsed the previous fall. The petition contained the personal statements of 71 plaintiffs. I had read 15 of them in succession when I noticed I was anticipating the next sentence of the next statement before I read it. I went back to the first statement I had read and compared it word by word to the most recent. The structures were nearly identical. The phrases were not identical, but the order of the phrases was identical. The emotional progression was identical. The timing of the realizations was identical. I read the remaining 56 statements in that case more slowly than I should have, because by the third hour I was no longer reading them as legal documents. I was reading them as evidence of a single shared experience that had been produced in 71 different houses by a single mechanism. After that case, I began keeping notes. I did not share them with anyone. The notes were not appropriate for the bench, but I kept them in a folder and over the next 13 years they accumulated. By the time I retired, the folder contained 204 entries, each summarizing the personal statement that had been most representative of the case. I went back through the folder in the months after my retirement. The entries had grown shorter over the years. By the end, I had stopped writing more than 2 sentences per case. The 2 sentences were always sufficient. By the time I read the 150th such statement, I no longer needed to read the body of the petition. I would read the case caption, the date, the number of plaintiffs, and the total dollar value, and I would know with high accuracy what the personal statements would contain. I want to be clear that this is not a comment on the plaintiffs. The plaintiffs were intelligent, careful, professionally accomplished adults whose entire experience of these schemes was being deliberately engineered by people who had refined the engineering across decades of practice. The repetition in the statements was not a failure of the plaintiffs. The repetition was evidence that they had encountered a system that had been designed to produce exactly that experience. I learned something else from those cases that I want to share. The schemes that took the most money were not the most elaborate. They were the most boring. The fund managers who attracted the largest groups of victims were not flamboyant. They were not aggressive. They were not promising fantastical returns. The most successful Ponzi managers I prosecuted promised modest, sustainable returns in the range of 9 to 14% annually. They presented themselves as conservative, careful professionals whose value proposition was the boring competence of their investment thesis, not its excitement. They were dressed in unremarkable suits. They held quarterly luncheons in unremarkable hotels. They returned phone calls within 24 hours. They sent thoughtful holiday cards. What I came to understand is that the most successful frauds against retirees do not look like frauds. They look exactly like the legitimate investment relationships that retirees have been told their entire lives to seek out. They mimic the form of trustworthy financial relationships so completely that distinguishing them from legitimate relationships requires a level of skepticism that most people, in dealing with someone they have come to like over months or years, do not maintain. I want to give you 4 observations from the cases I tried. First, the recovery rate for victims of these schemes is, across every case I tried, below 5 cents on the dollar. The legal system is not equipped to undo the harm. If you wait for the legal system to help you, the legal system will record your loss, but will not recover your money. The only protective action that works is action taken before the collapse. Second, the warning signs that appear in the final months before a Ponzi scheme collapses are recognizable, but they are easy to interpret as ordinary problems. The fund manager who has been responsive for 2 years becomes harder to reach. The quarterly luncheon is postponed twice and then quietly canceled. The portal goes down for routine maintenance, and the maintenance lasts longer than expected. A new investor who joins late is offered a slightly higher distribution rate than existing investors, which is not advertised but mentioned in conversation. These signs are not subtle once you have seen them 70 times. They are nearly invisible the first time. Late distributions are explained as banking delays. Portal outages are explained as technical issues. Reduced communication from the fund manager is explained as travel or family commitments. The interpretation of these signs as ordinary problems is the most expensive interpretation a victim ever makes. The correct interpretation is to attempt full withdrawal of the entire balance immediately and observe the result. Third, every legitimate investment manager in this country is registered with regulators. You can verify any registration in approximately 10 minutes through public databases maintained by the Securities and Exchange Commission. If the manager is not registered, the question of whether to invest is already answered. The investment is not legitimate. There is no exception to this rule that applies to the investment you are currently considering. Fourth, the people most at risk are not the financially unsophisticated. The people most at risk are the financially careful. The careful investor has saved, has accumulated capital, has reached retirement with substantial assets, and is at exactly the demographic moment when the schemes are designed to find them. The carefulness that produced the savings is not the same skill set that protects against the schemes. The two are unrelated. Recognizing this is the first protective step. I have been retired for 4 years. In that time, I have read about 30 new schemes that have either collapsed or are showing the early signs of collapse. The wrappers continue to evolve. The cryptocurrency schemes have given way in the last 2 years to artificial intelligence trading schemes that promise machine-driven returns generated by proprietary algorithms. The agricultural schemes have evolved into climate technology schemes. The product wrapper changes. The mechanism does not. I do not believe the rate at which these schemes are launched is going to decrease. I believe, based on the volume of new filings I see in the public record, that the rate is increasing. The available pool of recently retired Americans with substantial portable savings is the largest it has been in modern history. The schemes are designed to find them. The only countermeasure that works is information transmitted in time. If you have a parent, an aunt, a grandfather, a friend who has recently retired or who is approaching retirement and consolidating their savings, please consider sending this video to them now. The retirees most at risk are not the careless. The retirees most at risk are the responsible ones who have done what their parents told them to do and have arrived at their retirement with savings to manage for the first time in their lives. The scheme is engineered to find those exact people. I want to close with a single observation about my career. Of the 204 cases I tried, I cannot remember a single victim leaving the courthouse with what I would call a satisfactory outcome. The convictions provided a degree of legal closure. They did not provide financial recovery. The plaintiffs, in nearly all cases, left the courthouse holding documents that proved what had been done to them and that did not return what had been taken. I am no longer in a position to record these losses in the docket. I am only in a position to describe them, before they occur, to anyone who will listen. Thank you for watching. Please share this with the person in your life who needs to hear it.